Welcome back to the second micro lecture of the tobacco module. In our last lecture, we spoke about how tobacco growing processes and the commercialization of mass-produced cigarettes occurs. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the beginnings of regulation regarding tobacco sales and consumption. As we move through that regulation discussion, we will also introduce the idea of e-cigarettes and other vaping products. Let's get started. From our first lecture, you might remember that for the longest time, cigarettes and cigars were hand-rolled for sale. Sure, there were workers who rolled these products to be sold, but nothing was being mass-produced. Once the cigarette rolling machine was created, the cigarettes were able to be mass-produced for pennies on the dollar, and it was rare that cigars or pipe tobacco was used by the masses. Instead, cigars and pipes became synonymous with the richer classes. The workers smoked cigarettes and the bosses smoked cigars. Cigarettes ruled, and they ruled with a vengeance. Everyone smoked, and no one that was concerned about the health effects associated with cigarettes for the longest time. For a while, they were recommended by doctors as a form of medical treatment. In the days of patent medicine, cigarettes were actually prescribed to treat asthma. They open up the bronchial airways and help ease breathing, but in the long term, inhaling anything smoke-related isn't good for your lungs. So finally, in 1964, you see government regulation beginning, and the Surgeon General's office comes out and says that cigarettes may be related to lung cancer. This isn't the first time that the government has made that recommendation, but it is the one that seems to stick. However, despite that recommendation, we don't see the government mandating that cigarette companies put warning labels on their packs and cartons until 1970, when it becomes a requirement to warn about the dangers of cigarette smoking. These labels are coming from the idea that we need to regulate cigarette smoking and advertising measures. These warnings might appease the government, but they don't make big tobacco very happy. And for a while, you see a slight dip in cigarette sales, but they rebound when big tobacco takes extra steps to appease the consumer. How do they do it? Advertising. For the next couple of decades, big tobacco steps up their game big time. They advertise, they endorse, and they give away free things when you send in your UPC codes from your cigarette packs and cartons. But as big tobacco was getting bigger, people were getting sicker, and then they started to sue. The attorney generals of 46 states sued big tobacco, which is comprised of the largest 4 tobacco companies running at the time. They were Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Brown & Williamson, and the L'Oreal companies. The states were suing the companies over the Medicaid costs that were used by the states to cover the health care costs associated with tobacco-related illnesses. As part of the settlements, Big Tobacco agreed to pay out $200 million and would also be limited on their behaviors in regards to their advertising and such. If you account for inflation between 1998 and now, that settlement would be worth more than $300 million today. So what would Big Tobacco not be able to do anymore? They now have limits on their advertising. This means there are no more TV commercials and there are limited spaces for magazine ads. But there are restrictions on what can be shown in the advertising as well. For example, they are banned from showing cartoon characters in advertising. If you remember back, Joe Camel was one of the biggest advertising gimmicks that was out there. He was literally a smoking camel who used Camel cigarettes and was supposed to be a play on Joe Cool, the ulterior version of Snoopy, if you remember back to your Peanut days. But for some reason, the Flintstones were a large part of TV advertising for cigarettes, and later Tom and Jerry too. So no more cartoons. There was also a ban on branded merchandise. This meant that you could no longer send in your UPC codes and redeem them for merchandise. There used to be a system where if you sent in this many UPC codes, then you were eligible to get this product. They used to have a catalog of items, and there was even a Marlboro Atari system at one point in time. There were also limitations on sponsorships for sporting events. That's why you don't see any tobacco company sponsorships for teams or organizations. If you think about the number of endorsements that the NFL has, you see official everythings. Tide, the official detergent of the NFL, Bud Light, the official beer of the NFL, Papa John's, the official pizza of the NFL. There is an official everything and a commercial to go with it. But there is no official cigarette of the NFL, and that is due to this master settlement. They also had to disband the Tobacco Trade Organization and designate funds to support anti-smoking measures and research to reduce youth smoking. This meant educational programs, awareness campaigns, funding for research, and they had to limit the amount of advertising that kids were able to see. So no more billboards, no more bus wrappings, and nothing out in the public eye. That's a hard thing to do for a company who is trying to advertise their product. For years, cigarette companies created advertisements like the one shown in this slide. Marlboro in particular was a heavy advertiser and made promotions that portrayed smoking as a part of a healthy, active lifestyle. In fact, for years, the Marlboro Man was the epitome of the working man smoker. Ironic that he would later pass away from cancers related to cigarette smoking. Now you see next to no advertisement for tobacco cigarettes and an increase in the advertisements for e-cigarettes and vapes, but even that is now being limited. So here is a look at the Marlboro catalog that I mentioned before. Marlboro would call their UPC codes Marlboro miles. A pack was worth so many, and a carton was worth so many more than a pack. Once you got to a certain point, you would be able to redeem them for clothing or camping gear or whatever. In the early 90s, they had lunch boxes, coolers, water jugs, and all sorts of other things with the Marlboro logo stamped on them. I actually had an uncle who smoked so many Marlboros that he got all of this gear. He would collect it and give it to us all. My first school lunch box was a Marlboro mini cooler. I still remember that thing. It was damn near indestructible, and it held a lot of lunch, which was good when you were trying to barter for things better to eat at the lunch table. So when you smoke a cigarette, your body doesn't care about the tobacco, it wants the nicotine. Nicotine is a colorless, highly volatile liquid alkaloid. When you smoke tobacco, there is a rapid transference of nicotine to the brain. You will start to feel the effects of nicotine in about 10 seconds of inhaling the smoke. The nicotine enters the bloodstream through the lungs and starts to have an effect almost immediately. When chewed or dipped, nicotine is absorbed through the mucus lining of the mouth. Nicotine is a stimulant, so that means there's going to be a slight rush associated with the drug. Nicotine does not depress your CNS, but rather it affects it similarly to how cocaine would, but on a much, much, much smaller scale. So what effects do nicotine have on the body? Since it is a stimulant, you will experience that little rush of euphoria, certain increases in the rate of respiration, and there will be an increase in your heart rate and blood pressure. This means that your heart will need more oxygen, and you will need to breathe more frequently and deeper than without the nicotine. So you could see how this would help an asthmatic in the short term. But all of this depends on the way the tobacco is used and the type of tobacco that is being used. So it will depend on the exact composition of the tobacco. What is being mixed in with it? Taking a pinch of tobacco is the same as smoking 3 to 4 cigarettes. But smoking tobacco exposes the user to carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia, volatile nitrosamines, hydrogen cyanide, volatile sulfur containing compounds, volatile hydrocarbons, alcohols, aldehydes, and ketones. And finally, the amount of nicotine found in tobacco ranges from 0.2% to 5%, depending on the tobacco you get. So there's a lot of variables there. The nicotine effects are also dependent on how densely the tobacco is packed. If the tobacco is more densely packed, you will get less airflow through and more heat. If you pack it tightly, then there is not a hot smoke, and you don't want to burn yourself with this hot smoke. It can then also be difficult to keep the tobacco lit if it is too lightly packed. Some cigarettes have a filter, whereas others do not. Hand-rolled cigarettes often do not have a filter, but commercially packed ones can have a filter, but it is not mandatory to do so. Cigarettes never used to be filtered, and the majority of cigars are not filtered now. Look at this picture. There is a white filter and a brown filter. Why is one white and the other is brown? The filter was an attempt to try and create a safe cigarette, where the filter would catch all of the nastiness that comes with smoking through the chemicals. So do you think it worked? The volume of smoke inhaled also has an effect. Most people inhale the cigarette smoke, but they do not inhale the smoke from a cigar. Why? There is too much nicotine in the cigar, and you will make yourself sick. Plus, the chemicals they put into cigarettes helps the cigarettes burn at a lower heat than cigars do. Cigars burn too hot, and you will burn your lungs with the heat that you'd be inhaling. Finally, the number of cigarettes smoked also has a large impact as well. Cigarettes are lit for about 5 minutes, and you have an average of 10 puffs per cigarette. Most smokers smoke about a pack a day or less. There are 20 cigarettes in a pack, so roughly about 200 puffs a day. That seems like an awful lot of tobacco and nicotine to me. At the end of the day, no matter how you ingest the tobacco, the nicotine is what the user is after. As technology has advanced, it has become possible to isolate the nicotine and make a synthetic version that could be used in e-cigarettes and in vapes. Not only did this help create a new product line that was not regulated like cigarettes, but this new option helped to combat some of the stench of tobacco and the effects of the substance. E-cigarettes or vaping were developed and has taken off as the newest trend. You can also use e-cigarettes to smoke marijuana in states that allow for legal use. In an e-cigarette, there is no physical tobacco like there is in a regular cigarette. Instead, you have the liquid cartridge, which releases the nicotine to the smoker. The smell is better, and it supposedly has less of an effect in terms of secondhand smoke. But in the early days of vaping, there was no formal evaluation of the devices and the nicotine in terms of secondhand smoke. If you remember, there were quite a few news stories out there in which e-cigarettes were exploding and catching fire. So on that end, they're not very safe. But you can imagine that if you're smoking something and it is entering your lungs, then it is still not safe or doctor recommended. But we will see that there is a significant lessening of the detrimental effects compared to traditional cigarettes. One benefit of e-cigarettes is the variety of flavors that are out there. Some are more sweet than others and are even pleasant to smell, but you can still get them in more traditional tobacco flavors. And even then, you can get a Marlboro flavored one or a cigarette with menthol and such. If the goal is to make it more pleasant for everyone involved, I prefer that you smoked a sweeter smelling one, but to each their own. However, companies like Juul have mounted heavily on campaigns that advertise to younger smokers, specifically teenagers. As you may remember, the campaign that Juul launched was specifically geared towards younger smokers, specifically teenagers, and they went all out. There was such an increase in the number of teenage vapors that eventually the chickens came home to roost, so to speak. Like the Master Tobacco settlement, collective lawsuits started coming out accusing Juul of knowing the harm their products caused, yet they still advertised as though this was a healthy alternative to traditional cigarette smoking. In December 2022, Juul settled more than 5,000 cases brought forth by more than 10,000 plaintiffs who accused them of false advertisement, and advertisement of a knowingly addictive product, and more. They agreed to settle the lawsuit for $438.5 million, with each state who sued being eligible for more than $6.8 million each. 34 states were involved in the suits, and the money has been earmarked to help counter youth vaping. Juul had to lay off more than half of their workforce in order to try to avoid declaring bankruptcy. These lawsuits only impacted the production and sale of Juul-branded products, but did not impact other vaping manufacturers. However, during the same time that the lawsuits were ongoing, states were taking up legislative efforts to raise the age of tobacco purchase and use to 21, just like with alcohol. Texas was one of the first states to raise the age in 2019, followed by 20 others by the end of the year. By 2021, the federal government followed suit and made it mandatory for all states to raise the age to 21 in an effort to combat smoking with younger populations. As we know, tobacco has been a pretty permanent staple in American culture since the advent of our country. As tobacco use keeps decreasing in frequency, the cost of a pack of cigarettes keeps increasing in value. Long gone are the days in which tobacco use was seen as sophisticated and cool. Now it is simply associated with high cost, disease, and in some cases, an early death. A illicit and legal drug, tobacco, and eventually just nicotine, has its place in American society, but is quickly dwindling, and we are seeing fewer and fewer people smoke every year. Big tobacco is just trying to hold on, but it is becoming tougher and tougher for them every year. Thank you for joining me for our second micro lecture on tobacco. In the next module, we will turn to alcohol and discuss some of the similarities in regulation that we saw with tobacco use. I'll see you then.